Craig Wilson, editor of Stuff Magazine South Africa. Thank you so much for being here, man.
It's only a pleasure. Always a delight.
Man, you've been sick, man. What did they do to you in Spain?
Yeah, I think it was the transit back through Switzerland and 1 degree and, 400 other people's air on the plane for too long. But I'm feeling fat and fit.
That'll do it. So listen, you sent us a clip from Barcelona last week. We've got a sense of some of the things you were excited about at that point, right? And we could hear things in the background. You're on the streets. It sounded really exciting. What was the vibe?
So, Barcelona during this sort of event every year is completely and utterly insane. You can't find a hotel anywhere. There are just tens and tens of thousands of people. The streets are packed. And this year, the staff who sort of run the metro and the underground trains went on strike. And of course, it's the most effective time to do this. You get the most attention. But it meant that you couldn't take any trains for the first few days of the event, and there were crazy reduced services. So everyone was spilling out onto the streets. I saw people protesting, some of the staff protesting. They wanted wage hikes and this kind of thing. But it really just meant it was absolute chaos and bedlam because you were sat in traffic for at least an hour anytime you went anywhere.
I was going to ask you about that because it sounded like a soccer match in the background while you were speaking, reporting for the show last week.
Well, this is it. There were just sort of hundreds of people chanting in Catalan or Spanish. I couldn't tell. But yeah, lots of noise and lots of bluster. And it's kind of a strange town because when you go there for this, the cab drivers, for example, pretty much all except one I had while I was there refuse to speak English. It's not that they don't speak English, they just choose not to, and they make it very, very difficult. And so not having the public transport working makes it a somewhat less sort of efficient and pleasant experience than usual. But still, we're not there for the transport. We're there to see what the tech had to offer, and of course there was lots there.
The tech hubs of the world are probably listening right now going, we're so getting that event coming to our town very soon.
So they've got the contract, I believe, till 2020. So thereafter, it may go somewhere else. But the problem is it's gotten so huge that you can't just have it anywhere. It's a bit like CES in Vegas. It's gotten to the point that, I got the closing mails from Mobile World Congress to say thanks very much for coming. They said that they had 101,000 people through the doors over the 4 days. And, when you look at it's sort of spread over 8 enormous halls. If you imagine something like Gallagher Estate or the Cape Town International Convention Center, it's something like that if you times it by a dozen. To walk from one end to the other, if you don't stop, if you just walk from one hall to the other, takes 35 to 40 minutes. It is the hugest mobile trade show in the world, and you can't just put it anywhere. So we'll see what happens in 2020. But this year was interesting. I thought it, though, and we'll get to this, of course, that it was a bit less interesting than last year.
Let's get to that. You've set the scene, the vibe, the importance of this event, because you get events like this in other parts of the world, but I'm getting a sense that this is essentially the World Cup of mobile. And so what do you think? Let's start with what came out totally ahead of everything else in terms of a trend that everyone went, whoa, we'll never forget Mobile World Congress 2016 because of that innovation.
So, this year was all about virtual reality. That was the focus. And it's funny because last year was all about wearables, right? It was all about smartwatches, fitness trackers, that kind of thing. This year, there were some new ones, but they were really, really a small focus. And it's funny how quickly the focus can shift. In just a year, wearables went from being the biggest news to being, just another sort of item that people are updating. Virtual reality was what everybody wanted to talk about. So you had LG releasing their quite budget sort of VR headset. Instead of going the Samsung route where you clip your phone in to use it as the display, this is actually a headset with the display built in. It's not terribly high res. It's not, very high end. But it gives you a taste, and it's quite an effective, and I suspect it's going to be quite a cheap version, just to get you sort of interested and just to give you a basic experience of it. Then, of course, in the sort of mid-range, you've got the Samsung Gear VR, which is their headset that all of their top-end smartphones click into. And that's just the sort of next notch up, right? It's a little bit slicker, the experience is a bit nicer, and what you get, the package is just a little bit better. Those sell here, you can get them in South Africa already, they're about 2,000 Rand, and if you order the new S7 or S7 Edge from Samsung and you pre-order it before release date, you'll get one of those headsets free. So they were pushing that very hard as well. But then, you keep going up the list and you get the sort of Oculus Rifts, and then you get the HTC Vive. And that was undoubtedly the sort of most hyped, most exciting product to come out of this year. Now, it didn't come out this year. We already knew about it. It had already been talked about. But this was the first real opportunity to play with a finished consumer-ready version of the product. That's going to go on sale in the next couple of months, and it's going to cost about $800, which given our current exchange rate is going to hurt. But it's a really interesting experience. This is a full-on VR headset, sits over your head, has to plug into a very high-spec sort of gaming machine, which they also don't mention. Aside from spending, say, 20 grand on the headset and the controllers, you're going to need a really, really beastly desktop computer to run this thing. But it allows you to, it's got its own sensors and cameras on the outside, so it can sort of map the space around you and create sort of worlds accordingly. So it gives you the most immersive sort of VR experience that I think anyone's really seen yet. And to have it bundled in this consumer package was really exciting.
I'm going to ask you a very simple question. People all over the world listening to this podcast are thinking, why should we care? Why should we go on this trip with all these tech makers and their current fascination with VR? What is the impact in real terms for the average consumer? Let's start with you and I sitting here. Aside from the awe and wonder of just, visiting worlds that we're not actually in.
So I think that's it. I mean, for most people at the moment, this is just pure novelty, right? It's a gimmicky thing. You go, oh, wow. So I can see these sort of places that are, foreign to me. Or I've seen, I got an ad this week from one of the local travel agencies who are trying to use VR headsets to promote locations. So, things like the after school student Contiki saying like, here, we'll show you, what it looks like at the Parthenon and, some of the sort of spots that you might want to stop on a European tour. But this is the thing. For the most part, it's still very gimmicky. And I think they've got a long way to go before we find the really practical implications of this, things like, or implementations of this rather, things like training, education, simulations, like if you've ever been in one of those airplane simulations that they use to train pilots, I mean, that is this huge specialist piece of gear. It looks like a sort of container on a big arm. I think the potential to cut down the expenses on that kind of thing are fantastic. Like, say, for example, you mixed virtual reality and augmented reality, and you are doing a cross Africa motorcycle trip, and you break down somewhere, and the mechanic can download a sort of manual for your bike specifically, and then get video overlays over your actual bike to say, right, twist this, remove this piece here, look at this, check that it looks like this. I think those kinds of things are really exciting.
You just gave me an excellent idea. I can imagine sort of being on an expedition somewhere. I get stuck, I break my leg, or I need to operate on my own belly or something, and I've got this VR machine right in the middle of the mountain somehow and plugged in somehow, and they send me everything I need to know about how to operate on my own liver or something.
Exactly. I think the healthcare stuff is amazing as well, or in war zones, unusual things that happen, and that, you've got people with, I think it's great for people who have some skill already, say like doctors in far-flung regions who, have some basic medical skills but may need to perform a very specific procedure that they haven't necessarily done. I think it's things like that where VR has huge possibilities. But until then, in the meantime, really what we're looking at is it's a luxury, and it's a glorified sort of toy for those people who can afford to and who are interested. I mean, it is fascinating. It is great that it's going to change the way we, game, and I think also for rehabilitation, for training, for people who've had accidents or strokes or this kind of thing. I think there's a lot of potential there, but we've got a long way to go. And I guess what they're hoping to see is that gaming and the other motivators will help bring down the price and will help encourage more people to fool around with it and to find some of those really compelling use cases.
I do sense, though, some of these brands are using VR as a way to sort of flex their muscles and give the world a sense of we're ahead of the curve. How much of it is, a lot of it must be PR, surely, just to give people a sense that our brand's relevant and we know what we're doing. If we can make something this awesome, you ought to buy our smartphone.
There's a great deal of that, and I think LG in particular. We'll talk about their products quickly. Just so Mobile World actually runs Monday to Thursday, but every year the Sunday has some of its the announcements ahead of time. Now, last year it was all about Samsung. It was all about their S6 and S6 Edge. This year, LG very cheekily arranged their event a few hours before Samsung's and tried to sort of steal their thunder. And what they unveiled was their new flagship called the G5. We knew that was coming. The rumors. That's the other thing about these conferences. Before you go to them, you pretty much know most of the products that's coming out anyway, because nobody can keep a secret in this business anymore. So LG's...
Even Apple?
Apple just doesn't show up. Apple doesn't bother with conferences like Mobile World or CES. They just refuse and say, no, we don't even need to be there. Which is
Sure.
yeah, I mean that's sort of typical Apple for you. But anyway, LG's phone, what they tried to bill as the big selling point was that you can clip the bottom off it, so it's got a sort of modular design. You can pull the battery out, and then you can click the battery onto other fixtures or other additional modules. So you can attach like a camera grip and turn it into a more serious camera, or you can attach a Bang & Olufsen amplifier so that it provides better sound. But at the end of the day, like I played with these things and it was very cool. It was very cool because no one else was doing it. But it also wasn't something that I felt, I'm going to go out and buy this phone because I want all of these additional components. And I think this is often the problem, is that there's this huge drive to do something different and novel, but different and novel doesn't mean we're going to want to use it. Last year Huawei showed off a wristband, like a wearable, that had a Bluetooth earpiece that clicked in and out of it. And sure, no one else showed off anything like it. But I thought we'd all agreed years ago that Bluetooth earpieces are completely ridiculous. Unless you are in your car all the time, or you're somebody's dad, like no one, I don't know anyone under the age of 40 who uses a Bluetooth earpiece. Sure, some people will keep one in the car, but no one walks around with one anymore. That's become like a 90s movie sort of joke. And this is the thing, is that, like the Huawei wrist-worn earpiece or the swappable components of the LG, they're novel, but just because they're novel doesn't mean we want them.
So this whole Silicon Valley obsession with novelty for the sake of novelty, well, certainly falls flat around here, where we tend to buy into things because we can actually use them, or they are of a significant value to us. And let's talk about that. There's this huge narrative, the fact that we're probably the fastest growing, correct me if I'm wrong, the fastest growing mobile markets in, corporately as the continent in the world. And do those sort of narratives filter to places like Mobile World? And if they do, how are they delivered to the rest of the world, and what's the interaction?
So there were some talks about emerging markets. A lot of it, though, was focusing on things like more efficient ways to roll out 3G, 4G. Of course, then the Europeans are also already talking about 5G. And they were talking about connectivity. And this is it, how to get people connected. Mark Zuckerberg spoke at the Samsung S7 event about exactly that, and sort of bemoaned the fixation in the first world on faster and faster connectivity, when he said that really what we should be looking at is getting people in emerging markets who've never had any connectivity to speak of, or, who just aren't yet online, that really we should be focusing on that instead. And there was talk around it, but in terms of actual products and so on, when you went to brands and you spoke to them, the focus was very much on the top end of the market. It was very hard to get anyone to say anything really concrete about the lower end. I mean, even Ford, for example, Ford, the motor company, I spent a lot of time at their stand while I was there, and they were showing off their Sync 3, which is their in-car sort of entertainment and infotainment system. And I said to them, well, we spoke at length about it, about what had changed from the previous version, what it can do, how it's, how to make, how it's important to have drivers not be distracted on the roads, and this sort of thing. And we said, well, when is this coming to emerging markets? They weren't sure.
And so I was speaking to Gijs Kappers just the other day, the founder and CEO of Wise Talk, and a lot of the stuff they're doing over at Wise Talk has to do with the reality on the continent, which is, in terms of mobile, which is we still have tons of feature phone users, and that's not changing quite as quickly as people thought it would. Sure, a lot of people are taking up smartphones, and that's happening faster than we expected, but certainly not dropping off in terms of not using feature phones. And so what's your take home from everything you saw, given our reality in Africa around the use of feature phones still?
So the feature phones one is fascinating too, because it's increasingly it's not a problem about the cost of smartphones, right? We're seeing tons of sub $100 smartphones. We're seeing smartphones that are getting so cheap they compete with feature phone prices. I mean, even local operators like Vodacom and MTN have basic smartphones that are under, I think, 700 Rand for some of them. The problem there, though, is battery life, right? Feature phones maintain a huge appeal in part because the good ones will last 4 or 5 days on a charge. And this is, I guess, again, what a lot of people forget. When electricity is irregular or difficult to come by, that sort of longevity can make a huge difference to your actual experience of using a device. It's no good if your device has GPS and a camera if it's, off and doesn't work for half of the week and you can only keep it running for a day and a half. So I think feature phones still have an enormous enormous place and role to play in this market. We see this with Alcatel as well. Now, Alcatel rebranded at Mobile World. They used to be Alcatel One Touch. They've now dropped the One Touch bit, and they're still really dedicated to releasing high quality feature phones. We played with a couple of them, and they're just fantastic. And they've really understood, I think, that for emerging markets, this sort of product isn't going to go away, and that there is great value in continuing to eke out everything you can from that market segment. So it is nice to see that some people do still pay attention to it, but it's always difficult at these kinds of events because obviously, it's all about the flashiest and the best and the newest and the greatest. And so there is, if you dig deep enough, there is some emerging market stuff, but it's by no means the focus. And everyone seems a little sort of surprised when you want to talk about it.
What you just said about Alcatel reminds me of what made Peugeot thrive in the 80s and 90s with their 504, firstly their 404 models and their 504 models, essentially coming to grips with what people actually needed. In fact, such a success that it's rumored that it nearly financially ruined them because the cars were so good, they lasted so long, they were perfectly attuned to the climates they were created for. How much of the efforts around making what people need is limited or stymied by the fact that people or these companies simply just want to make more money doing things or basically milking markets for what they're worth?
So that's a huge point, and that's when they came up with a lot of the people I was traveling with. We kept talking about this, saying Apple, for example, even Apple for a long time would have you believe that it was this independent, it blazed its own trail, it did what it wanted, but that's just not the case anymore. It's got to put out a phone every September. That's what shareholders have come to expect. And frankly, I would love to see more of the smartphone manufacturers or any of these sort of consumer electronic brands really taking a step back and saying, we're not going to play this game anymore. We're not going to put out a phone every year. What we're going to do is we're going to put out a phone every 2 years. And we're really going to make sure that when you move from, whatever it is, Model 6 to Model 7, the difference is not incremental. It shouldn't be a case of, even with the Samsungs, with the S7, the joke was that all they've really done is repaired the mistakes they made on the last one, like putting the SD card back in that people got really upset about when they removed it. But, the S7 looks like the S6 in the same way that the iPhones, the 6S looks like the 6. I would really, really love to see people taking a step back and saying, let's hold off and let's do really innovative stuff before we bring it to market. Because frankly, a lot of the people I spoke to too are getting, absolute sort of upgrade fatigue. I mean, I've had it myself. I've stopped. I can't be bothered to get the newest iPhone. There is such an incredibly broad array of mid-range Android phones available that it's becoming increasingly hard to justify, particularly in light of the exchange rate, spending 12, 14, 15,000 Rand on a phone.
What's that in dollars?
Well, that's it, like $1,000 a phone, right? And of course, it shifts depending on the month. But I mean, my last iPhone, I bought a 6S, a 6 Plus, the big one. I bought it in the States, and it cost me just over $1,000. And at the time, that was, say, 12, 13,000 Rand. When I had it stolen and I got a quote for my local insurer, the quote from the local iStore was 17 and a half. And you're just like, I mean, that's 2 laptops. And 2 laptops is the beginnings of a small business. I just cannot justify it anymore. And a lot of people I spoke to said they felt the same, that there were diminishing returns on spending this much money on a device. That a lot of them were quite happy to buy a Xiaomi, for example. Xiaomi had a presence at the show as well. And I think they're doing really interesting things by building smartphones that are both budget but feel high quality. Huawei, meanwhile, seems to have gone the other way. Huawei for a long time was billing itself as that kind of company, high end product, low price. Now, frankly, increasingly it feels like it's high end product, high price. It's just playing in the same sort of market. Sure, they're a bit cheaper than the Samsungs and the LGs and the HTCs, but they're not that real value proposition that someone like Xiaomi offers. And I think you're going to see even, obviously for the execs who have the 500, 600 Rand a month contracts, who just tick it over every 2 years and get the newest phone, that top-end market's going to stay the same. But I think a lot of people are becoming a little more sort of price-sensitive and going, but am I really getting that superior an experience by paying twice as much for a device? I think the answer is often no.
What's the vibe in terms of software development, the app makers for mobile? Because it seems the focus seems to be by the hardware guys. What was the scene there? People like WhatsApp, for example, or I don't know, Truecaller, or what sort of presence do they have at a show like Mobile World Congress? And what do you think they'd be looking to do while there?
So some of the companies we saw are the likes of No Roaming. They're a company that lets you use local networks when traveling so that you don't have to pay crazy roaming fees. That's a mixture of sort of hardware and software. They make these soft SIM stickers that go over your existing SIM card, and then everything else is app-based. Then there were people like Telegram, who's a WhatsApp competitor. Actually they had a huge party to celebrate the sort of bridging of 100 million users one of the nights that we were there. And, they were talking up messaging alternatives to WhatsApp. WhatsApp, of course, while this was all going on, or just afterwards, announced that they will no longer be supporting a lot of older devices from the end of the year, notably things running Android version 2 and Android version 3, Nokia's Symbian operating system, but most alarmingly, BlackBerry, and not just older like BB7 devices, but BB10 devices. So, that's going to be a real blow for BlackBerry. Even the things like the Z10 devices that aren't especially old. WhatsApp has now said, look, this is just not worth our while. And it's funny to see software companies having that much sway. Obviously, the great giant of software back in the day was Microsoft, and it showed us just how much clout a software company could have, over hardware manufacturers and how much they are beholden to them. But things like WhatsApp, when you think in 2009, when WhatsApp was really getting going, BlackBerry was the de facto phone, not just in Africa or India or emerging markets, but in developed markets. BlackBerry was the phone to have. And here we are 6-7 years later, and WhatsApp saying there are so few people using these devices, relatively speaking, obviously not in emerging markets, but globally, that they're not going to support it. So on the one hand, you worry that, support falling away for this would be terrible, particularly for a lot of people in Africa who still rely on these devices combined with this service. But I guess what could happen is services like Telegram or Line or WeChat may jump in to fill that gap. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. But the software is absolutely integral, and making things too that can continue to work on both the sort of entry-level device and the top-end device, and provide, perhaps not quite all of the same features, but a base experience that's indistinguishable. I guess this is the challenge for those software makers.
I can't help feeling like it's a kick in the teeth of developing markets, a vote towards what we discussed earlier, which is let's not try and change the world unless it helps us make money. It's problematic for me, I think.
Yeah, I find it very troubling, and it's curious because it seems to go against WhatsApp, what it said that it stood for in the early days. But I guess once it's been, now it's Facebook owned, perhaps the priorities have shifted somewhat, or perhaps it's just saying this, we do run a business and it's inefficient for us to look after more platforms than necessary. But one has to wonder whether BlackBerry will now continue to fade and continue to shift its focus to Android devices like the recent Priv. It may be the case that by the end of the year, BlackBerry's focus is mostly on BlackBerry hardware running Google's Android software, but we'll have to wait and see.
And so what's your sense of who's dominating the scene, Android versus iPhone at the moment? Who comes out of a conference like that? Of course, Apple doesn't. I didn't even realize Apple didn't even attend. Sure, such cheek. But they didn't even attend. So who's winning this battle for the minds of men?
So, certainly outside of the first world markets, it's Android by a mile. It's funny, you go to the US, if you go to San Francisco, or you go to New York, or you go to big European cities. I'm often surprised at just how prolific the iPhone actually is. I guess because here it remains so clearly a niche item. Sure, we see plenty of them, but that's because we're involved with people who work in tech, and we're involved with, people who can afford these sorts of devices. But for the most part, Android is leading by far and away. And I think there's also been a great shift in how people feel about it. At least the people I've spoken to. There are a lot of people I spoke to who used to be dyed-in-the-wool Apple fans. And that seems to be weakening. It feels like, in some sense, like Apple's just not quite as slick and quite as tidy as it used to be. People I know who used to run their everything on Apple are saying, well, AirDrop doesn't always work. That's the sort of transfer tool, between devices. Things just aren't as slick and as reliable as they used to be. Android, meanwhile, is getting better and better. I'm busy. I'm running an Android phone now as my primary device for the first time in about 4 years. I used to be one of those Apple folk. And I got to say, the experience is great. It's really easy, and it doesn't make a difference anymore that I use a Mac computer and an Android phone, because pretty much everything I'm using is Google anyway, right? It's all cloud-based. All the documents go to Dropbox. My mail comes through Gmail. My calendar comes through Google Calendar. It just happens, the end device, the hardware kind of matters less and less to me because I'm way more embedded in the software services that I've decided to use. Those are the ones that matter. And of course, it's in their interest to make sure they work on every platform. So it's curious to see, how this is sort of shifted over the years. But I do feel like Android, and Apple has lost a little bit of that shine that made it so terribly special. And it's in part because of this pressure to continually push out new stuff. The last version of iOS claimed 180 new features. Now, I'm sure most people couldn't tell you, what 10 of them are. And even then, how many of them are they actually using? And it feels like, they're features for feature's sake. Whereas I guess the flexibility of Android and its ability to power everything from basic devices to the latest, shiniest, top-end Samsung, that gives it a leg up and gives it a role in emerging markets that's not going to go away anytime soon.
Well, it sounds like the democratization of tech that Android offers the world essentially is leading to innovation that outstrips what you might experience having the smartest people in a room in Silicon Valley try and fix something or try and improve something to the point where it's amazing and we all want it. So listen, what do you guys think? Give us a shout on @AfricanRoundup on Instagram and Twitter. Give us a sense of which mobile trend is tickling your fancy at the moment. I don't know how mobile a trend VR is really, because I can't imagine walking around with these massive things on our heads everywhere. So perhaps that's what tickles your fancy. Perhaps it's something less pretentious, if I could say that. Perhaps it's something that you've used in your corner of the world, anywhere on the continent. Give us a shout and let us know what your sense is of our discussion. You can send us email at hello@africantechroundup.com. On Facebook, we're African Tech Roundup. And of course, you can always leave a message right on the website at africantechroundup.com. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us on the show, joining me today on the show. Craig, please keep going to Barcelona so we don't have to deal with all those gridlocks and the rest.
Absolutely, an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to chatting to you guys again soon. We'll talk as the year progresses and see. I mean, what's amazing is how quickly stuff changes. So who knows what we'll be talking about in 6 months' time, right?
I caught that pun though. How quickly stuff changes. That's Craig Wilson, editor, of course, of Stuff Magazine South Africa. Thanks again.